Welcome. We are going into a really challenging and unsettling case today. It's one that took a decorated police officer and, well, exposed him as a predator. And in doing so, it fundamentally betrayed the public trust he swore to uphold.
That's absolutely right. The sources we've gathered chronicle the life of Drew Peterson, a former police sergeant from Bolingbrook, Illinois. But this isn't just a true crime narrative. It's a critical look at, institutional failure, domestic abuse, and how the legal system really struggled to adapt to a killer who thought he could use his own badge to cover his crimes.
So what we're aiming to do here is to synthesize a deeply complex and frankly disturbing timeline. We really need to clearly lay out the known facts around the murder of his third wife, Kathleen Savio, and then the continuing, just agonizing mystery of his fourth wife, Stacy Peterson, who vanished back in 2007.
And crucially, we have to untangle the monumental legal battle that followed this. The prosecution faced an almost impossible task. They were trying to prove murder without a body in Stacy's case, and they were relying heavily on statements from victims who were no longer there to testify. The way the law, specifically around hearsay, was challenged and changed in Illinois is one of the most fascinating and also troubling parts of this whole story.
Drew Walter Peterson, born in 1954, is currently incarcerated. He's looking at a potential release date of May 7, 2081. His notoriety just exploded when Stacy Peterson disappeared, and that disappearance acted as the catalyst, really forcing authorities to reopen the investigation into Kathleen Savio's 2004 death, a death that had been, just incorrectly ruled an accident. It's such a tragic chain of events where one missing person finally brought justice for the person who came before her.
It is. And when we look at the start of his career, Peterson presented himself as this solid community member. He was a lifelong resident of Bolingbrook, graduated in '72, joined the U.S. Army. His early military experience is pretty significant, too. He trained as a military police officer in Virginia, which gave him early exposure to investigative procedures and, legal systems.
And by 1977, he'd secured his long-term position with the Bolingbrook Police Force.
Right.
That's where he began a tenure that lasted for 3 decades. He wasn't just, a beat cop. He was engaged. He served on the Metropolitan Area Narcotics Squad in 1978. And early on, he was actually celebrated. In 1979, he received the department's Police Officer of the Year award. This reputation as a model officer is what made everything that came later so shocking and so difficult for that community to process.
The irony is just profound, isn't it? Here's a man being publicly recognized for his service while he's secretly building this history of domestic violence and threats behind closed doors. Now, if we fast forward to his professional end, he retired as a sergeant in November 2007 at age 53. The timing here is absolutely critical. It was right as this massive state police and FBI investigation into Stacy's disappearance was just ramping up.
And the financial side of that retirement was, at the time, really substantial. When he initially left the force, he secured a significant tax-free pension. It was around $79,000 annually, which, that translates to nearly $6,600 flowing into his bank account every single month.
And he collected that pension for years, even while he was the prime and eventually the sole suspect in both his wife's disappearance and his former wife's death. It wasn't until his second conviction, that murder-for-hire plot conviction in May 2016, that Illinois law finally allowed for the termination of that pension. Think about the audacity of that. A man under indictment for murder collecting a generous state salary for the privilege of retirement.
It just underscores a theme we see over and over here. The system was protecting him until it absolutely could not anymore. Now, let's trace the path in his private life, starting with those early marriages, because that's what really establishes this foundation of control.
His first marriage was to Carol Brown. It lasted 6 years, from 1974 to 1980, and it ended because of his infidelity. They had 2 sons. So this sets an initial pattern of betrayal, of instability, but the second marriage. That's where the documented history of specific frightening threats truly emerges.
Yes, the decade-long marriage to Victoria Vicky Connolly from 1982 to 1992 is incredibly illuminating for anyone trying to understand this. Connolly detailed just enduring domestic violence throughout their time together. But it's not just the violence that's so important here, it's the language he used.
This is the absolute crux of understanding his later actions. Connolly alleged that during their marriage, Peterson specifically threatened that he, quote, knew how to kill her and make it look like an accident. This is not a generalized statement of anger. This is a direct, chilling weaponization of his professional knowledge. He wasn't just saying he'd hurt her. He was claiming an expertise in forensic obfuscation.
And if you consider that testimony, which was delivered years later, it serves as almost a premeditation blueprint for what happened to Kathleen Savio. He basically provided the jury with his own modus operandi long before the crime even happened. It suggests a professional detachment, an almost clinical approach to violence, knowing exactly how to exploit the flaws in an investigation process.
And the abuse wasn't just limited to his wife. Connolly's daughter, Lisa Ward, who lived with them from the time she was 8 until she was 18. She also reported experiencing severe physical and psychological abuse from Peterson. This just paints a picture of systemic, familial control and violence that spanned years. It shows his ability to intimidate and control those close to him was just deeply ingrained.
And the marriage to Connolly dissolved in 1992 when she discovered Peterson was having an affair with Kathleen Savio. It's a tragic handoff, really. Savio was stepping into an already established pattern of dangerous behavior. The sources make it clear. That specific threat, the domestic abuse allegations, this context is the necessary frame through which we have to view Kathleen Savio's death.
It connects his private rage directly to his public profession. That specific phrase, make it look like an accident, that's the key. For investigators years later, it wasn't just a threat, it was evidence that the idea of staging a scene was already familiar and, accessible to him, thanks to his decades of police training. This insight was profound, and it helped frame the argument that Savio's death was premeditated.
So moving into that third marriage, a relationship between Drew Peterson and Kathleen Savio, it lasted from 1992 to their finalized divorce in 2003. And it was a period of intense, really well-documented conflict. They had 2 sons together, Thomas and Christopher.
The instability was chronic. The police were called to their house a staggering 18 times on domestic disturbance calls between 2002 and 2004, right before her death. This wasn't some secret disagreement. This was a well-known, volatile situation, repeatedly flagged by law enforcement. And yet somehow, it didn't raise enough alarm bells when her body was found.
The circumstances of her discovery on March 1st, 2004 are just deeply, deeply troubling. She was found nude in a dry bathtub in the master suite. The immediate physical evidence at the scene was highly suspicious, and yet it was ignored.
Indeed. The reports describe extensive bruising and scraping all across her back, her torso, her face. And most alarming was a large, unexplained gash to her scalp. A simple, accidental slip and fall, the narrative that was later accepted, it just does not typically result in such widespread and varied blunt force trauma, particularly when it's confined to a dry tub.
Which leads us to the critical, almost unforgivable error of the initial investigation. Despite the history, despite the visible trauma and the volatility, the coroner's jury ruled her death an accidental drowning. How could that possibly happen?
This is where Peterson's institutional position becomes the essential tool for concealment. The sources confirm that the coroner's jury that made this determination, it included a police officer, someone who personally knew Drew Peterson. And that officer assured the other jurors that Peterson was a good man and could never have been involved.
That one detail just highlights the complete failure of due process. A trusted figure in law enforcement essentially vouched for the prime suspect in a suspicious death and immediately steered the investigation away from homicide and toward accident. The neutrality of that finding was completely compromised by internal relationships and, professional loyalty.
And the consequence was catastrophic. The case was closed, and Peterson's immediate behavior only deepened this suspicion years later. Less than a month after Savio's death, he put the house up for sale. When he was selling it to the new owners, he actively concealed what happened there. He stated he was selling because the kids simply preferred the pool at his other residence. A man mourning a tragic accident doesn't typically scrub the event from the narrative just to ensure a smooth sale.
The truth was just buried for years, and it was only resurrected by the disappearance of the next woman in his life. The case was finally reopened in 2007.
That's when the crucial step of exhumation occurred, on November 16, 2007. The initial review had been so shoddy that a second look was absolutely essential. And Dr. Michael Baden, a highly respected former New York City medical examiner, he reviewed the findings, and his conclusion was a complete game changer.
Dr. Baden concluded that Savio died of drowning, yes, but only after a physical struggle, and that her body was subsequently placed into the bathtub. This explained the extensive bruising. These were injuries sustained during a fight, not a fall. The state's attorney at the time, James Glasgow, he then publicly stated what they now knew to be true. He said he believed the death was a homicide staged to look like an accident.
And that assessment was confirmed officially on February 21, 2008, when the cause of death was definitively changed from accidental drowning to homicide. The professional cover-up that Peterson had allegedly orchestrated, the very one he had threatened his previous wife with, was finally undone.
And the connection, the bridge between these two women, was forged by what Stacy Peterson knew. We have the critical testimony of Reverend Neil Shorey, who was Stacy Peterson's pastor. Stacy told the Reverend that Drew killed Kathleen Savio and made it look like an accident, and that she was terrified of her husband.
This is more than just crucial information. It really forms the foundation of the later legal strategy. Stacy wasn't just some observer. She was the person who had provided Drew with his initial official alibi for the night of Savio's death. Her later confession to the Reverend meant she realized she had been an unwitting accessory to a crime. She was not only terrified that Drew would realize she was talking, but also that the police would realize she had lied for him previously.
And this realization, that the current wife held the key to the previous wife's murder, is what truly forced the re-examination and gave the prosecution the theory of motive for Stacy's eventual disappearance. He had to silence the person who knew too much.
Exactly. The re-examination of Savio's death was purely reactive. It was triggered by the profound anomaly of the next wife just vanishing without a trace. It really underscores the severity of the pattern of behavior that Drew Peterson had successfully hidden until the sheer number of victims became undeniable.
So let's turn our attention to Stacy Ann Peterson. She was born in 1984 and was incredibly young, just 19 when she married Drew Peterson, who was 49. This was on October 18, 2003, right after his divorce from Savio was finalized.
Stacy was a young woman with a really strong sense of family. They had 2 biological children together, Anthony and Lacey. But crucially, Stacy also legally adopted Savio's 2 sons, Thomas and Christopher, and she treated all 4 children as her own. She was committed to raising them and was close to completing her nursing degree from Joliet Junior College. She had plans, a future, a family life she was devoted to.
She was officially reported missing on Monday, October 29, 2007. Peterson's version of events, his official alibi, was simple. He claimed Stacy called him at 9 p.m. on Sunday, October 28th, stating she had left him for another man and had abandoned her car at Cloud International Airport in Bolingbrook.
The immediate investigation, which was launched by the Illinois State Police and the FBI, it centered on Peterson right away. He retired from the police force in December 2007, and investigators immediately began executing search warrants, seizing firearms and both his and Stacy's vehicles. It signaled the seriousness of the suspicion they harbored. And Stacy is, sadly, still classified as a missing person.
The suspicious activity that surrounds the immediate aftermath of her disappearance is key, and it largely revolves around these large containers. We learn about the blue containers.
Yes. Rick Mims, a friend of Peterson for many years, he provided evidence that he and Peterson had purchased 3 large blue plastic containers from a cable company where they both worked part-time. This was back in 2003. Mims even provided photos to the police. While the contents or the final location of these specific containers are unknown, the purchase itself, long before the disappearance, raised immediate flags about, planning and preparation.
And even more chilling is the account of Thomas Morphy, who was Peterson's stepbrother. He had a history of substance abuse. Morphy attempted suicide just 2 days after he allegedly helped Peterson carry a large plastic container from the home to the SUV.
Morphy's fear was palpable. He believed he had helped dispose of Stacy's body. The weight and the nature of the container combined with the timing. It led him to such profound distress that he tried to take his own life. This wasn't just someone speculating. This was someone who felt he was actively involved in covering up a crime.
And observations from neighbors corroborated this suspicious activity with large objects. Neighbors reported seeing Peterson and another man hauling a massive 55-gallon barrel, which is certainly large enough to hold a person out of the house shortly after the disappearance. This pattern of moving large, heavy containers immediately after Stacy vanished established a clear timeline of evidence disposal.
And while some of the initial leads, like those involving truckers referring to containers, proved unreliable, they were found not to have been in the area when they claimed. The core suspicion around the barrel and the blue containers remained central to the state's theory that Stacy was killed and her body was immediately disposed of.
Now, we have to address the intense media circus that Peterson deliberately cultivated while all this was unfolding. Peterson and his initial attorney, Joel Brodsky, they engaged relentlessly with the press. They appeared on Chicago radio, gave interviews to Steve Dahl, and even went national on CNN's Larry King Live.
This media engagement was strategic. It was designed to project an image of a wrongly accused, grieving husband and to muddy the waters with speculation about Stacy running off with another man. It was a calculated performance that eventually became so disruptive that a Will County judge, Stephen White, had to step in and severely limit Peterson's access to the media.
And then came the utterly bizarre engagement stunt in December 2008. Peterson briefly became engaged to a young woman, Christina Rains, who was also 23 years old. Stacy's exact age at the time she disappeared.
That behavior just speaks volumes about profound narcissism and control. Rains later moved out quickly after her father intervened, expressing concern over the control Peterson was exerting. Rains herself eventually moved out, and she flatly stated the engagement was a publicity stunt. It was designed to keep Peterson relevant and sympathetic in the media spotlight. He was using a young woman to try and prove he was normal and dateable rather than facing the immense criminal investigation centered on him.
Despite the public spectacle and the intense media scrutiny, the formal indictment for Kathleen Savio's murder didn't arrive until May 7, 2009. Peterson was arrested, and the bail was set at an astronomical $20 million.
His arrest plunged him into financial distress, despite his sizable income. The sources note that he actually sued JPMorgan Chase for revoking a home equity credit line that he intended to use to cover his soaring legal fees. He claimed his income of nearly $109,000 per year, which included his police pension, was insufficient to meet his defense costs. It just reveals this profound arrogance, still demanding access to luxury financing while facing murder charges.
He remained in Will County Jail because Judge White ruled he posed too great a danger to the community to be released on bail. This really reinforced the state's belief that he was capable of violence and was indeed responsible for the two women.
Okay, so now we enter the most complex and critical part of this entire case, the legal battle that was centered on the hearsay challenge. This case fundamentally changed how Illinois handled statements from victims who'd been silenced by the defendant.
The prosecution understood very early on that they lacked the traditional smoking gun. They had no body for Stacy, and the Savio scene had been compromised from the start. Therefore, the statements that Stacy and Kathleen had made to other people, the hearsay, were absolutely essential to the case against Drew Peterson.
Right, and to explain hearsay simply for you listening, generally statements made out of court are inadmissible in court. The reason is because the defense cannot cross-examine the person who said them. They can't challenge that testimony. But in this case, the witnesses were unavailable because the defendant was believed to have killed them to prevent them from testifying.
So initially, Judge White issued a very mixed ruling in May of 2010. He stated that prosecutors had proved Peterson killed both wives by a preponderance of the evidence.
Let's pause and unpack that terminology because it's vital. The standard preponderance of the evidence is the standard used in civil court. It basically means it's more likely than not, a 51% chance. So the judge believed Peterson was guilty under this lower standard, which is why he was allowed to admit certain evidence to the court.
Right. But the critical problem was the criminal standard. Beyond a reasonable doubt. A standard that requires near certainty. So even though the judge believed Peterson killed them by that 51% standard, he ruled that nearly all of Stacy's crucial statements were inadmissible for the actual criminal trial. He said they do not provide sufficient safeguards of reliability for the much higher criminal standard of conviction.
This put the prosecution in an immediate bind. They had a strong theory of the case, powerful circumstantial evidence, and even a judicial belief in his guilt. But they were legally prevented from using the victim's own words in the main trial.
This immense legal difficulty led directly to legislative action, which is a highly unusual step. The Illinois state legislature passed a specific piece of legislation, known informally as Drew's Law. Formally, it's 725 ILCS 5115-10.6.
This legislation was passed while the search for Stacy was still ongoing. It created a path for courts to consider statements from unavailable witnesses, if the prosecution could prove two things. First, that the witness was killed specifically to prevent their testimony, and second, that the hearsay statements themselves were reliable.
The passage of Drew's Law immediately drew controversy.
Yeah.
Critics argued it was legislating a rule specifically to secure a conviction in a single high-profile case, basically compromising the principle of established law for the sake of, political or emotional expediency.
And even under this new tailored law, the trial court initially found only 8 out of 14 statements admissible, so the prosecution was still facing an uphill battle. However, the final legal breakthrough came not from the new legislation, but from an existing, though rarely used, common law doctrine.
That breakthrough arrived in April of 2012, when an Illinois appellate court reversed the trial court's decision and allowed key hearsay statements from both Savio and Stacy into evidence. They did this by utilizing the common law doctrine of forfeiture by wrongdoing.
This is the critical insight that allowed the conviction to happen, and it's far more legally robust than Drew's law. Forfeiture by wrongdoing states that a defendant essentially forfeits their Sixth Amendment right to confront a witness, which is a cornerstone of the U.S. legal system, if the defendant was the one who caused that witness's unavailability.
So in simple terms, the court was saying, if Peterson killed Stacy to prevent her from testifying against him in the Savio case, he cannot then complain that he doesn't get to cross-examine her statements. He cannot benefit from his own crime.
Exactly. This doctrine proved less restrictive than Drew's law because it focused solely on the defendant's corrupt intent to silence the witness. It sidestepped all the complex reliability tests and constitutional challenges that plagued the newly legislated rule. It was a powerful legal weapon that ensured the ends of justice were not defeated by the perpetrator's violent act.
So with this crucial hearsay evidence finally admitted, the Savio murder trial finally began. And while the hearsay was compelling, there was also a critical piece of direct evidence.
That evidence came from a witness named Jeff Pachter. Pachter testified that Peterson had offered him $25,000 to hire a hitman to kill Kathleen Savio. He told Pachter it was a secret he would take to his grave. This was powerful evidence of premeditation and an intent to orchestrate a killing that preceded Savio's death itself.
On September 6, 2012, Drew Peterson was found guilty of the premeditated murder of Kathleen Savio. The jurors later confirmed that, despite that direct evidence from Pachter, the emotional and factual weight of the hearsay statements, Stacy's fear, Stacy's confession to her pastor, were the most compelling evidence leading to their conviction.
He was sentenced on February 24, 2013 to 38 years in prison. But the audacity of Drew Peterson, it did not end there. Even behind bars, his belief that he was above the law continued.
This brings us to the astonishing second conviction, the murder-for-hire plot that he orchestrated from within prison walls. On February 9, 2015, Peterson was charged with 2 additional felonies, solicitation of murder and solicitation of murder for hire, and the target. It was James Glasgow, the state's attorney, who had successfully prosecuted him.
I mean, think about the sheer arrogance required to attempt to assassinate the very prosecutor who put you away. He was seeking revenge and asserting this perverse form of control even while he was locked up. The evidence was secured through classic investigative work. A fellow inmate alerted prosecutors to the plot and subsequently wore a wire, capturing Peterson detailing his plans.
The second conviction arrived in May of 2016, and on July 29, 2016, he received an additional 40 years added to his existing sentence.
This massive 78-year sentence ensures he will spend the rest of his natural life incarcerated. And it was the second conviction, the one proving he remained a dangerous, unrepentant threat to society, that finally allowed the state to terminate that substantial $79,000 annual tax-free pension he had been collecting all that time. Justice in this regard was painfully slow, but eventually comprehensive.
Following his initial sentencing, he was briefly at Menard Correctional Center before being transferred to federal custody in February 2017. He went to USP Terre Haute, Indiana, due to concerns about the security risks of keeping a famous former cop in state custody.
And his notoriety proved to be a liability even in prison. While at Terre Haute, he was assaulted by another inmate who reportedly hoped to steal his belongings to sell them on eBay. It's a grim reflection of the public fascination and, well, exploitation surrounding his case.
His conviction for Savio's murder was upheld by the Illinois Supreme Court in September 2017. Later, in December 2019, he was moved again, this time transferred to an undisclosed out-of-state facility under the terms of the Interstate Corrections Compact Agreement, purely for security reasons.
We can confirm his current location as of October 2021. He resides at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, Indiana, identified as inmate number 279193. And even now, he continues to fight the conviction. He filed a handwritten petition for post-conviction relief in October 2021.
His latest legal filings allege, among other claims, that State's Attorney James Glasgow intimidated witnesses during the 2012 trial. It's just a continuation of his pattern of blaming others and refusing to accept any accountability.
And while the legal system achieved closure and conviction regarding Kathleen Savio, the most poignant and significant unresolved mystery remains: the fate of Stacy Peterson. She is still officially classified as a missing person. Her family continues to live in just agonizing uncertainty.
And this leads us to the highly contentious and emotionally charged claims made by his former defense attorney, Joel Brodsky. In May of 2022, Brodsky made headlines by claiming he knows everything about both of Peterson's wives and publicly stated he was considering revealing confidential information protected by attorney-client privilege about what happened to Stacy and where she is.
This is a monumental ethical and legal tightrope. Attorney-client privilege is sacrosanct in the legal profession. It allows clients to speak freely to their counsel without fear of reprisal, and breaking it often results in disbarment and criminal charges. And Brodsky was already dealing with legal penalties related to his law license for unrelated matters and was under a gag order.
So the question becomes, what moral weight does that privilege hold when the client is a convicted murderer, and the knowledge held involves the location of a missing person, a mother, and a daughter?
For Stacy's family, the legal technicality is secondary to the human need for closure. Stacy's sister, Cassandra Kellius, publicly stated that she would stand by Brodsky and support his actions if he came forward. She prioritized finding her sister's body and achieving resolution over the legal formalities concerning attorney privilege. The family's desperation here just overrides any typical legal considerations.
Brodsky's claims remain unverified, but the implications are staggering. If he does possess knowledge of Stacy's whereabouts, his potential revelation could finally resolve the central mystery of this entire saga. It pits the fundamental ethics of the legal system against the profound grief and the right to closure for a victim's family.
We have traced the complete arc of this dark story. From Drew Peterson, the highly decorated Bolingbrook police sergeant, leveraging his professional standing to threaten and conceal violence, all the way to a man convicted of premeditated murder and solicitation of murder for hire, now serving 78 years in an Indiana prison. His downfall was intrinsically linked to a pattern of profound domestic control and violence that tragically claimed or destroyed 2 lives.
Though the legal system secured justice for Kathleen Savio, utilizing these innovative legal maneuvers like forfeiture by wrongdoing, the central human tragedy endures. The case of Stacy Ann Peterson remains officially unsolved, keeping her family in constant, agonizing limbo.
You have to consider the immense ethical weight of that situation. The struggle between the legal principle of attorney-client privilege, which protects secrets, and the overwhelming moral imperative to provide a family with the location of their loved one. The legal victory is tangible, but the emotional cost of that unresolved silence is just immeasurable.
So what do you believe is the more compelling force in this entire narrative? Is it the unprecedented legal victory secured through Drew's law and the forfeiture doctrine, or is it the ongoing powerful silence regarding Stacy's whereabouts and whether the ethical walls of the law should or eventually must collapse to bring true resolution to her case?
Thank you for joining us for this exploration of the sources we had.
Thanks for listening.